media says that we're not having an honest conversation about why the attack in Dallas occurred or the events leading up to it. Joining us from St. Louis, author and radio host Kevin Jackson. He's also a Fox News contributor. Kevin, what aren't people focusing on that they should be focusing on?
Well, every time we have this discussion, Judge, the Black Lives Matter group or the leftists, the whiners, are always, why are we talking about black-on-black crime when all this stuff is going on with the police? And, the fact of the matter is they don't want to have an honest discussion because of the roughly 6,000 blacks that were killed last year. You're talking about a small fraction that are killed by the police. In fact, at this point, there have been 561 deaths by cop. 275 of them are white, 136 are black, and 86 are Latino. So we're talking about a pretty small section of the black community. So where are these other black deaths occurring? They're occurring at the hands of other blacks. And so when you look at that statistic and you start thinking about the fact that blacks commit felonious acts at 6 times more than the national average, then you understand why you have such a higher police presence. But they want to ignore these things because the narrative, unfortunately, of politicians is every time something like this occurs, we've got to get black people frothing at the mouth. And this is strictly it truly is a political discussion.
Let me see if I understand this. Kevin, what you're saying is that something that we already know, and that is that blacks are being murdered by blacks primarily, almost 80%, something like that, correct? Let's just talk about black-on-black crime.
Black-on-black crime is well into the 90s. Now, the argument by blacks...
Okay, good. Hold on. And what you're saying also is that the vast majority of people who are killed by cops are white. But there are more whites in the country than blacks. So does that not make sense?
Well, sure. But when you start looking at the crime rates of blacks, and that's where I said earlier, 40% of the police officers that have been killed were killed by black men, who represent 6% of the population. Okay. So if you look at the math on that alone, you're looking at the amount cops roll up on black men with the idea that I'm 40% more likely to be killed by a black man than anybody else in the country. That stat in and of itself is shocking. 6% of the police officers that have been killed were killed by black men. So if you're having an honest discussion, look, there are bad cops, there are bad doctors or whatever, but 40%, I'm sorry. But at the end of the day, you cannot ignore these stats, and that's the problem. Is the left wants us to continually dismiss the crime rate.
How does a lie and racial tensions and racial hatred benefit the left? Why would they do that?
To be honest with you, it's really based on votes. And some people would argue that they love having that level of ignorance in the population. I mean, I get asked this question all the time. Kevin, how do we change it? The first thing out of people's mouths is education. Well, I call the schools and all the systems that have been set up to so-called educate people, these are manufacturing plants of ignorance. And to have this discussion in a meaningful context with Black Lives Matter and to dispel these narratives that cops are out hunting blacks. If you look at the situations that have happened, Judge, in the last whatever bit of time, it isn't cops that just willy-nilly showed up at these events. Somebody called them to go investigate something. That's how they got there.
Well, you know what? But Kevin, it's not only that. What people don't understand is that cops are trained a certain way, and you have to, when they tell you to do something, you do it. And when they see a gun or when they hear a gun, it's an immediate reaction. They don't have time to look back at the video. What did you see? But I want to ask you one last question. Very interesting listening to you, Kevin. We're going to have you back on. But tell me about you. You didn't have such a great experience as a kid, and you said you live in the hood. Talk to me.
Yeah, I mean, I live in the hood. When I was growing up, my dad was he was a prisoner in San Quentin, and he was there most of his life. He committed armed robbery. My mother died when I was a kid. I mean, black folks talk to me and they think I'm some silver spoon kid, and they're like, Kevin, you're talking down to black people in this. I'm not saying black people we certainly aren't any worse than anybody else in the country, but we've been put into situations that have created an ecosystem where we cannot survive without with doing some unfortunate things.
Or feeling that you're a victim.
Well, look, I grew up that way. I never felt I was a victim. I knew what the game was. And the fact is that a lot of game, and that's what we call it in the vernacular, is being run on black people, and it's being done by the left, who wants us to believe that we're victims. At one point, they want to make us feel powerful, as with Barack Obama as president, but in the next breath, they want to tell you you're always the perennial victim.
All right, Kevin Jackson, very interesting. Thanks for being with us tonight. And next, a member of Dallas's finest.